The Turnaround Kid, What I Learned Rescuing America's Most Troubled Companies, by Steve Miller, narrated by Dick Hill. Copyright 2008 by Robert Stevens Miller. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Collins, an imprint of HarperCollins Publishers, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. This book is dedicated to the memory of Maggie Miller, 1937 to 2006. For 40 years, she was both my mentor and my tormentor. At times, she warmed my heart, and at times, she gave me heartburn. No one ever brought me more joy or more grief, and if I had it to do all over again, I'd do it all over again. Prologue, August 11th, 2006. It was past midnight as I drove through the deserted streets of suburban Detroit. My plane from New York had been delayed for hours by thunderstorms. I was exhausted from 2 long days of negotiations with lawyers and representatives of General Motors and the creditors and stockholders of the bankrupt Delphi Corporation. The latest in my string of complex industrial rescue missions, Delphi, a $27 billion global auto parts company with 180,000 workers, was my responsibility. The talks had been torturous and frustrating. Normally, the details would be swimming in my head, and I'd be eager to get home to share them with my wife, Maggie. Instead, nothing of what was discussed in New York was on my mind as I sped past darkened houses and commercial strips. I wasn't headed for home. I was driving to the sprawling complex of Beaumont Hospital, where Maggie lay dying of glioblastoma, an incurable brain cancer. After parking my car in the hospital lot, I wound my way through the corridors and then took an elevator to the hospice floor. I pushed open the door to her room. The darkened space was washed with an eerie green glow from the lighting outside. There was no movement or sound. In the shadows, I saw our eldest son, Chris, at Maggie's bedside, holding her hand as he had done all night, every night, for the past 6 days. "She's gone," he whispered. She had stopped breathing 20 minutes before. The way she looked, lying still with her mouth open, made it seem that she was as surprised as I was by this turn of events. Although I had known this moment was coming ever since Maggie's condition had been diagnosed in late May, I was stunned. As I sat down, I was flooded with emotions. I was angry, mostly with the weather gods who had denied me one last moment with Maggie while she still lived. I was also relieved that the nightmare of the past 3 months, watching her slip away, was finally over with, and I felt that strange, hollow sensation that comes with such an enormous loss. Maggie, who had been my mentor and occasional tormentor for as long as I could remember, was gone. Chris got up and left us alone. I told Maggie I loved her and would miss her. I leaned over and kissed her and held her hand. She was still warm to the touch. It was another 10 minutes before a young doctor arrived and perfunctorily pronounced her deceased and began filling out the paperwork. After the doctor came the chaplain, a cheerful and rotund fellow, who said all the right things about life and love and family and death. Then he held hands with us in a circle next to the bed for a word of prayer. At the nurse's station, they had all the paperwork ready to go. 2 months earlier, Maggie, always the consummate planner, had insisted I go to a funeral home and get everything set. Also, being a consummate skinflint in some ways, she had insisted on a simple cremation. No fancy casket, no memorial service. I had no intention of defying her last wishes in this regard, so I signed the papers, made sure Maggie's body was going to the right place, and then left with Chris. Chris would spend the next 18 hours in his hotel room, recovering from near exhaustion. I returned to the apartment in Troy, where Maggie and I had been living since I accepted the Delphi job a year earlier, in July 2005. I wandered around a bit and stared at all the touches, a picture here, a potted plant there, that she had added to make the sterile rooms our home away from home. Then, overwhelmed with fatigue, I crawled into our massive bed. Maggie had been my bedmate for more than 40 years. We had held each other and cried in this bed after getting her prognosis. Now it felt like the emptiest place in the world. After a few hours of sleep, I arose and dressed and went to pick up our youngest son, Alexander, at a nearby hotel. Still in shock, and occasionally in tears, I was trying to grasp the notion of being a widower. Chris needed time to himself, so Alexander and I went to the funeral home as they were opening for the day and completed the arrangements for Maggie's cremation later that same afternoon. Because I was the CEO of one of the nation's major corporations, one that was going through a widely publicized bankruptcy restructuring, Maggie's death would be news. At her insistence, we had told almost no one of her condition, so her passing was going to come as a shock. I had a lot of calls to make, and I needed to take some time with details such as death notices and obituaries. I went into the office to work on these tasks, and was immediately, and almost absurdly, reminded that in the midst of my personal grief, which felt so enormous and all-consuming, the world continued to turn, and the demands of my professional life were not going to let up. For weeks, a militant union group called Soldiers of Solidarity had been planning to picket Delphi headquarters, and this was the day. And so it was that on this brilliantly sunny morning, scores of protesters from Delphi operations all over the state of Michigan arrived at the entry to our complex and rallied in full view from my office window to show their disgust at the company and at me personally. They chanted slogans, marched on the sidewalk, and carried placards saying things like, "Replace Delphi Board of Derelicts," "Delphi cooks the books, workers get burned," "Save pensions, jail frauds," "Ready to strike." My personal favorite was a sign belittling my decision to accept a salary of just $1 a year during a restructuring that was going to cost thousands of workers their jobs. It read, "Miller isn't worth $1." Even in this dark hour, I could appreciate the life-goes-on irony of the moment and the wit behind the signs. Karen Healy, one of Delphi's top officers, wasn't so calm. She marched outside to confront the protesters and told them that they might want to reconsider their demonstration out of respect for Maggie's death. There was a moment of awkward silence, and then a sharp rebuttal. "Workers die all the time," they said. The pickets stayed and were in full voice as I departed for the funeral home in mid-afternoon. Alexander and I went to view Maggie prior to her cremation. Chris was not ready to confront this kind of reality. The viewing room was big enough for 30 or 40 chairs, but Maggie was an intensely private person, and, fittingly, Alexander and I were the only visitors. We each had a few minutes alone with Maggie, who looked peaceful in her favorite Lance nightgown, the red and white one decorated with images of little dogs. She also wore her only watch, a $12 special with the Coos and Deschutes logo of our model railroad on its face. With her in the casket were an elaborate origami crane from our third son, Robin, and a handmade card from our only granddaughter, Weston. As I stood beside Maggie, I recall that my father had said it was important to touch the dead so that we can absorb the finality of their passing. I leaned over to kiss her goodbye and touch her hand. She was cold and wax-like. My father was right. In this moment I knew she was really gone. We followed the hearse that took her to the crematorium, a graceful white marble building in the middle of a beautiful cemetery. Once Maggie's casket was placed in the cremation oven, the attendant closed the huge and dignified brass doors that shut it off from view. Alexander went with the man in charge and personally activated the control to start the burning. We stayed for a while and talked about what was happening, but there wasn't anything further to see. When I was back at my apartment, the phone rang. It was New York's Governor, George Pataki, calling to express condolences. I thanked him, and in the almost awkward silence, chatted a bit about work. I told him we were committed to keeping open our two big operations in New York, at Rochester and Buffalo. He thanked me for keeping jobs in his state, and sympathetically reminded me to take care of myself in the coming weeks and months. That night, Chris, Alexander, and I had dinner at a Japanese restaurant that had been one of Maggie's favorites. It seemed strange to be there without her. It seemed stranger still that on a day filled with so many varied and demanding experiences, that I wouldn't be going home to talk them over with her. In the last 24 hours I had worked feverishly on the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. I had come home to the death of my wife of 4 decades. I had been picketed at my office, kissed Maggie goodbye for the last time, and then chatted with the governor of New York, reassuring him about Delphi jobs in his state. In the quiet, when day was done, I realized how little I had ever reflected on the life I had lived at high speed for almost 30 years, moving from one corporate rescue to another. I was also struck by the fact that very few people, be they lawyers, stockholders, picketers, or politicians, ever seemed to understand that as we struggled to save big companies, they were dealing with a flesh-and-blood human being, with compassion and emotion, not some one-dimensional caricature with a digital calculator for a heart. As Maggie knew, I took every challenge personally, and from the beginning, with the Chrysler rescue, sought to lessen the pain while preserving what assets could be saved for workers, owners, debtors, and communities. These companies had never been mere numbers to me. They were always human endeavors, and the solutions I sought were based on rather idealistic values and what I understood of human nature. These were the things that Maggie and I discussed every evening. Life's turning points invite us to take stock. I was confronted with one of these events in Maggie's passing, and it occurred at the intersection of controversies involving the fate of a major corporation, the anxiety of a workforce under duress, and a turning point of our global economy. These are more than enough impetus for this book, which I hope is something more than a business memoir. It is my attempt to understand, share, and explain a life spent performing rescue missions at the highest levels of corporate America in partnership with many allies, including the one I lost on August 11th, 2006. Chapter 1. Family, Values, Maggie, and Me. The sky was overcast and fog hung over the harbor, so even though it was 10 o'clock on an August morning, the air was cool and the light was soft. Add the salty smell of the sea and the groan of the foghorn at the end of the nearby jetty, and this place, the small city of Bandon on the southern coast of Oregon, felt like home. I hadn't lived here in decades, but the connection was strong, and I sensed it right down to my bones as I stood in front of the little house where I had spent many of my happiest days. Painted gray with red trim, the 2-bedroom cottage has been abandoned for years. Dust coated the siding, dirt streaked the windows. I opened the door and saw the faded floral wallpaper that had been there since the 1940s. Inside, I found a familiar green sofa. All the fixtures, from the kitchen sink to the ceiling lights and bathtub, were just as they were when I was 6 years old. The frame from my bed sat in the corner of the tiny room where I slept as a child. In the stillness, I recalled the sounds that greeted me from outside when I awakened on summer mornings. The sharpest of them all was the grinding whine of a huge bandsaw making the first cuts on a Douglas fir. It blended with steam whistles, the shouts of men, and the rumble of passing trucks to create a kind of industrial music. I also recalled certain scents: grease, sawdust, smoke, even exhaust fumes, that filled the air every day but Sunday. All these sensations and images washed over me because this house, where I had gone to touch my roots and renew my confidence in the midst of crisis, once sat in the middle of a relentlessly busy industrial complex. Built atop a long wooden pier that jutted into the harbor, it included a huge sawmill, circa 1910, shops and outbuildings, and a dock where coastal steamships were loaded with shipments for delivery to distant ports. It was called the Moore Mill and Lumber Company, and my grandfather, the manager and eventual owner, lived right in the center of it all. Scenes from an old Oregon sawmill are not what most people find when they search their childhood memories, but I spent most of my preschool youth, my summers, and many school vacation days at the house on the pier in Bandon. As the first grandson of David and Emma Miller, I came in for extra attention. This was probably not fair to my siblings, David, Randy, and Barbara, and quickly came to love being with them. I took my first steps in their home and immediately began following my grandfather's lead. "Let's go out to the mill and see if they're working or shooting the breeze," he'd say to me in the morning. I'd scramble to get dressed. Usually I wore a plaid lumberjack shirt, dungarees, and work shoes, and then tramp after Grandpa as he made his rounds. I was fascinated by it all, but the sawyer who could turn a massive log into a stack of neat boards made an especially big impression. I could watch him for hours. When I was old enough to avoid most of the dangers, I was allowed to roam free. I played in the corners of the mill complex and watched the endless parade of men, trucks, ships, and lumber. On one occasion, Grandpa caught me riding the conveyor that hauled scrap wood and sawdust to the incinerator and gave me a stern lecture on safety. Sometimes I'd even clamber aboard the ships at the mill dock, and the crew would give me lunch. Without knowing it, in every moment I was absorbing vital lessons about the dignity of work and the rewards of honest enterprise. In late summer 2006, as I walked to the little office building next to my grandfather's house, I felt the presence of the people of Moore Mill. Inside the abandoned office, a half-dozen swallows flitted around the ceiling lights in the rooms where bookkeepers, clerks, and salespeople once worked. Antiquated business forms filled the shelves in a back room. A mechanical adding machine gathered dust on the floor. Where Grandpa's desk had stood, scraps of wood were piled 3 feet high. On a wall near the entrance, grime marked the place where the time clock and time cards were kept as workers checked in at the start of each shift. Here, for generations, hundreds of men had started each workday. Management and labor formed a team to make not just 2x4s, but good lives for themselves and their families. The mill was the source of the money they needed to buy homes, feed and clothe their children, and save for the future. As an industry, it was not an abstraction, but rather the heart of the local economy. It turned the region's most valuable natural resource into a source of prosperity and pride. The mill's payroll fueled commerce. It paid taxes that kept the city going. It even sponsored the semi-pro baseball team, the Bandon Millers, who were the pride of the city every season. My earliest memories of baseball involve Bandon Millers games, where I sometimes served as bat boy. Even at the ballpark, Grandpa wore his vested suit, tie, and fedora. A gold chain stretched across his belly, connecting the watch he kept in one vest pocket with the little knife hidden in the other. He was over 6 feet tall, a little bit stout, and his white hair gave him a sort of formal, distinguished look. He had an air about him that suggested a sense of purpose. His competitive spirit, whether it involved getting the best players for his semi-pro ball team or building his company by acquiring additional mills and timberland, was strong, but tempered with the kind of realism expressed by so many people who had lived through the Great Depression. Though always loving, even indulgent with me, at the mill, Grandpa was a serious manager who made sure things were done right. This was especially true when it came to safety. Sawmills are dangerous places, and though injuries were inevitable, he was a stickler about proper handling of tools and materials. He was also firm about production schedules. Customers depended on Moore Mill delivering on time, and he was determined that they be satisfied. But while he was the boss, my grandfather was never a bully. Mutual respect governed his relationship with everyone at the mill, and I could see and feel in everything he did both his affection for the place and his sense of responsibility. He took all of it, the company, the workforce, Bandon, personally. My grandfather lived at the mill and worked every long day that it was open because he understood what it meant to real people. He had a feeling for the way that industries created opportunities for individuals. After all, he had been born into the working class. He had risen from the rough-and-tumble logging camps of British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest to mill manager, and then finally, at the ripe old age of 65, a mill owner, all without a high school diploma. Grandpa also knew how this operation, a simple lumber company, contributed to the well-being of the local community and a growing America. He had come to Bandon to run its biggest industry in the days following a great fire that had destroyed the entire city. The mill's success had financed the post-fire recovery and lifted the people of Bandon out of their trauma. During World War II, Moore Mill aided the war effort with lumber to build bases and encampments. In the post-war years, the studs that steamed away in ships named the Alvarado and the Oliver Olson, among others, were used to build the suburbs of Los Angeles, San Diego, and many other cities. There's something solid and essentially good in the history of the mill and Bandon. And I was lucky that when I returned to my mother and father in the not-so-big city of Portland, the virtues I had learned in Bandon were reinforced every day. Although he had joined the professional class, becoming a prominent lawyer, my father, Robert S. Miller, worked harder than anyone I have ever known, often donning his suit and tie and heading to the office on holidays and weekends, and even Christmas mornings. As principal outside legal counsel, Dad was a key figure in transforming Georgia Pacific Corporation from a small Southern plywood company into a huge global forest products conglomerate. He set the standards for ethics, character, and achievement that I would try to match in my own career. And it was GP's founder and chairman, Owen Cheatham, who pushed me to add a business education to my law degree so that I would be properly prepared. He was right. I would forever be grateful for what I learned at Stanford Business School, which I attended after getting a law degree at Harvard. But still, the important stuff about human character, values, and leadership, I learned in Oregon. This education began with childhood observations, continued when I was given some work to do as an adolescent, and truly took hold when I was a young man. It was then that my father and Grandpa sent me into the forest to labor as a real lumberjack. I did most of the jobs that were part of harvesting giant fir trees, including the dangerous work of breaking up log jams in local rivers. I can't say I was equal to the men who spent their lives in the forest. I wound up in the water almost every time I cleared a jam. But I loved the satisfying feeling that comes with giving your all to the point of exhaustion and then getting up to do it again the next day. Besides offering me the chance to experience hard, satisfying work, my grandfather also introduced me to the world beyond Oregon. When I was 8, he took me on my first trip east to New York for a World Series game. Everything I saw, from the stadium to the skyscrapers, opened my eyes to the possibilities in life. But nothing excited me more than the sight of Moore Mill lumber piled at the docks in Brooklyn. Here, thousands of miles from home, was evidence that what happened in Bandon mattered. 4 years later, another trip east gave me further inspiration. Traveling this time with my father and brother David, I had lunch in the Capitol with Oregon Senator Wayne Morse. Somewhere between the famous bean soup and dessert, Senator Morse looked me in the eye and told me I should make sure to serve others and the greater good when I grew up. The message stuck. Whether you consider life in the little gray cottage with red trim, the bustle of Moore Mill, and the wider world that Grandpa and my father showed me, it's obvious that the family base in Oregon, and especially Bandon, formed my life's foundation. And though I'm in my 60s now, the place still pulled on me. There's no wondering why, in the waning days of summer 2006, when I faced 2 enormous challenges, I instinctively returned to walk the mill site, explore the nearby forest, and visit my family for inspiration. One of these challenges was very public because it involved my efforts on behalf of the huge Delphi Corporation, an auto parts and electronics supplier that had become an industrial basket case and was widely viewed as a bellwether for the entire U.S. auto industry. Spun off by General Motors in 1999, the company was losing about $1 billion per quarter on annual sales of roughly $28 billion. Delphi had all the problems that afflict old-line, heavy industries in America. Born as a spin-off from General Motors in 1999, it was saddled with labor costs equal to GM's, but about triple the competitive labor contracts elsewhere in the supplier industry. They had been negotiated under conditions that had changed, and included retiree obligations that proved unsustainable. On top of this, many of the goods it made could now be manufactured much more cheaply abroad. Delphi's day of reckoning could no longer be put off, and to be realistic, its distress signaled just the start of what will be a painful but necessary restructuring of the entire American car and truck manufacturing industry, which people loosely call Detroit. The size of Delphi's problems, its status as a major industrial player, and a genuine belief that I could help led me to come out of retirement in June 2005 to accept the job as its chief executive officer. I had initially thought to refuse the job and remain in my comfortable retirement in Central Oregon. But when I asked the recruiter why I should even consider undertaking such a stressful, arduous task, he simply replied, "Because your country needs you." It was the only thing he could have said that would have motivated me to accept. Beginning with Chrysler in 1979 and 80, I had helped about a dozen companies in similar straits with enough success that the Wall Street Journal had dubbed me U.S. Industry's Mr. Fix-It. I take a less serious view, telling people they can find me in the yellow pages under Flaming Disasters. In Delphi's case, it seemed possible that I might help to salvage at least some of its jobs, assets, and intellectual capital for the good of everyone. Included in my concerns about the future of this Fortune 100 company were all the communities where it operated and the larger American economy which would benefit if we could preserve at least some of the best parts of an important old-line industry. Equally important, a disastrous outcome for Delphi could take down General Motors and much of Detroit with it. The tools at my disposal as I went to work at Delphi were limited, and included, among others, the legal protection of a bankruptcy process to buy time, negotiations to reduce labor costs, and restructuring the company's domestic.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?